All right, good morning, folks. Welcome to the Directors Roundtable, which is neither round nor one table. My name is Ed Rodley. I work at the Museum of Science in Boston, and I'm also on a new member of the board of MCN, so I would like to take the opportunity to welcome this distinguished panel of directors who have all graciously agreed to come here. I think everybody's here for the first time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'd like to just give you a little bit of background on the session and what we hope to do. So what I'd like to spend most of our time doing is actually having a conversation. So one of the things that has happened a lot in MCN, museums and the web, all of these communities of practice that we tend to love to come to, is we talk a lot about issues, and we talk a lot about big issues. And one of the things that that the board was particularly interested in is that one voice that is usually missing from these discussions is senior management. And if you've listened in on any of the conversations here, you'll often run into people saying, well, my administration, my director. So we thought it would be very useful to actually have a bunch of museum directors come and talk a little bit about what it's like from their vantage point. So we have 4 museum directors who have agreed to join us. We have Janet Carding, who is the director of the Royal Ontario Museum, Eric Siegel. Eric, what is your actual title these days? I'm Director and Chief Content Officer at the New York Hall. Chief Content Officer. Yeah. That's the part I always forget. You have to salute. Okay. From the New York Hall of Science. Dan Spock from the Minnesota History Center Museum, and Brian Ferriso from the Portland Art Museum. And what we'd like to do is give everyone a few minutes to talk a little bit about, from their own museum's viewpoints, what they see being the pressing issues in terms of these digital technologies that we talk about disrupting everything and anything. And then open it up to the floor to have a little bit of a discussion and give you the opportunity to ask questions that you might not ask of your own director, and see what happens. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Janet Carding.
Thanks, Ed, and thank you very much for putting together this panel. And I think I half understood when Ed talked to me about the idea of this panel, what it would be about. But now that I've been here for a few days and listened in to a lot of the sessions, I think this is a really good idea, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to be able to talk to you. So I'm going to start off, and I'm going to try really hard not to talk for 20 minutes. I'm going to save some things for these guys to talk about. But I'm going to also have a go at answering the questions that Ed set when he sent out the abstract to us all. So first off, do I see technology as being disruptive to the museum that I lead? And I think the answer to that is a big yes. I think it's directly disruptive in that there are new technologies that we could be using, or we might be using, or we're thinking about using, or we already are using, that are changing the way that our museums work. But I think it's hugely disruptive in an indirect way. If I think about it in the same way that music industry or broadcast or publishing or newspapers are going through enormous change at the moment, that some of the big societal changes that technology is causing is impacting on museums as well. And I think that we've seen some of that, and I think we've got a whole load more to come. I think also for my museum there are lots of other things that mean that we have to change as well. It's not just technology, and the economy is a big factor for us. The stakeholder relationships. I'm a government agency of a museum, so I've got to work with the government, I've got to work with donors, and of course I've got a constituency of around 1 million people who come to the museum every year who want a stake in what we do as well. And I think that technology is always brought to me as something that needs substantial investment, and I have to say more often than not that presents itself therefore as something as a problem rather than a solution, and so that's something that we can talk about more. If I was to think about what I can bring to these conversations, I think that as a leader of a museum, I can do a better job, and I've made a start on this, but I think it would be great to have your advice this morning on this, is how I can create the kind of conversations in the museum that I lead so that we can talk about these strategic issues and we can talk about the kind of things that we're doing in a museum. And Ed said to me, he said, oh, but mission statements are really tough. And I don't think it's about a single sentence. I think it's about a strategic conversation where as a group we can understand the context that we're operating in and the things that we want to do and the impact that we think those things are going to have. And so I need to be able to create spaces for those conversations. I need to be able to give people permission to come into those conversations and say sometimes things that the rest of us don't really want to hear. And I need to give people the tools so that they can then go away and make things happen when we make some decisions after those conversations. So that's what I think I can do. the last point that Ed made to us in his questions was what skills did I think that people would need? And I think there's a whole range of skills that we all need, and I need these things too. But I think whenever I'm asked by a young person entering the museum field what kind of things they should work hard to be good at, I always say the same things. I think we all need to be brilliant listeners, a lot better than we are at listening. We need to be able to ask great questions. We need to be fantastic at communicating in a non-technical way to all of the different people that we're talking to, because building alliances and partnerships is what we do, and we need to be able to be as good as that internally as we often are externally. I always think it's a great irony that museums can be great partners outside their own organizations, but we often find it hard to talk to each other. And so somebody who's got those levels of communication skills, that's one of the things I think we all need. The second thing I'd highlight is that I think we all need great facilitation skills. I think we all need the ability to be able to bring together a group of people who have different perspectives and get them working together with a simple process so that we can solve problems and we can come up with new ideas. And I think if we can do that, then actually we can find ways to introduce technology into our organizations that will mean that museums have a fantastic future. We might do some things differently, but we'll still have the key role in the community that I believe that we should have. So that's me. That's my starter.
All right. Eric?
That was great. That was for me. I'm not sitting here answering emails. I'm sitting here taking notes on what she's saying, because I think one of the things that I'm hoping that one of the things that we can do here that's useful to you is to try to have an open conversation of what it takes to get things done in our museums and from the senior management's role. And I was saying earlier at breakfast, one of my favorite things to have happen is to have somebody come into my office and say, "Boy, this is this great idea I have, and how do I move this ahead?" Whether technology or not. And sort of help to coach the person to how to move it to the next level is really one of the sort of pleasures of my job. And it happens very infrequently that I have that first discussion. People don't come to me that often with ideas, and almost never do we have the second discussion after I told them what I think needs to be done. So I'm doing something that's not necessarily right. We're a science and technology museum in New York City where we are, technology is part of what we do. It's not added on. I report to a CEO. By the way, one thing you should absolutely know about directors, we all have bosses, and none of us operate without bosses, with whatever our title is. I've been trying to think if there's any, the Dylan song, "You Have to Serve Somebody," constantly comes to mind. I was trying to think if there's anybody who doesn't, and I haven't been able to come up with it. Bill Gates, yeah. Not anymore, right? It's probably true. Technology is baked into what we do. My CEO is a technologist. Her background is in technology and education. So there's never been a question that we are going to be doing things with technology. And we have, as part of our strategic plan over the next 5 years, a commitment to do nothing that only exists at the museum. So everything we do has to have a bridge outside the museum, and typically that's through using technology. So we don't have any problem with the technology argument. What we have is a problem with who gets to say what we're going to do next, and who gets a chance to contribute to that. And another thing from a director's point of view that it may not be as obvious to you as it is to us is that it's just a hell of a lot easier for us to set our strategic direction by 6 of us sitting in a room and saying, okay, well, this is what we're going to do, and that's that. And because we're all very facile with that discussion, we all know the ins and outs of funding. We all, we have a shared vocabulary. All the senior management, we've been working together for a while, and not that many people get to participate in that discussion, and that's something we really stink at. In general, and I know few exceptions to that, and then the really admirable exceptions that go out of their way to create processes. And I think you have to do that. You can't just be casual. I think that's when I said I invite people into my office and say, please come and tell me about what you want to do, or they send me an email and I say, come and talk about it, and they don't. I think that's because we're casual about it. We don't have a process that really integrates people's input. So, one of my takeaway messages here, is to try to amend that and to incorporate more people into the strategic thinking that we're doing. The other thing that I sort of want to highlight is that it's much easier to get the attention of senior management if you have already built consensus across groups, so that if you thought horizontally about how your initiative is going to serve audience development, how it's going to serve education, how it's going to serve the curatorial team, and you've already had those conversations, then you're sort of 7 out of the first 9 steps that need to be done in order to think about whether something can actually be implemented in the museum. On the other hand, nothing we do at the museum has happened without an extremely passionate, committed person who is advocating for it. So don't underestimate the power of somebody who just says, look, this is just important and it's brilliant, and I saw it being implemented somewhere else and we just have to try it, and showing pictures. And so all the persuasive devices that you have at your disposal should be brought to bear on this. But consensus building across your colleagues is really a powerful and difficult thing to do. It's sort of a subset of what I was just describing before. It's much easier to sit in your room and think about it, a good idea, than it is to air it in public and have it go through the give and take. So those are the kind of the takeaways that I'd like to start with here. And what I'd love to be talking about with you people is not just sort of the conceptual approach, but what are some practical steps we can do so that the ideas that you think are important in your museum can reach another level and gain traction.
So I guess my perspective comes from a couple of different places. I spent about 13 years of my early career working in a children's museum, so that made me very focused on audience, and I was sort of inculcated in a very audience-centered sort of paradigm. And what that's left me with is a legacy of insecurity about whether we know enough about what we're doing in terms of the kind of impact that it delivers. I think when I kind of zoom back out, I think part of the problem that we have in our field, and I'm with Janet in the sense that I think new technology has an absolutely transformational impact on all of society, and museums inevitably will be impacted by that change, and are already, I think, to a large degree being impacted. But I think that when I was a kid, my mother used to say to me, if you want to keep a job, make yourself indispensable. And if you sort of extrapolate that, I think that's good advice for anybody who's working in any kind of a job of any kind. But if you extrapolate that to the institutional level, I think of institutions as being about service, and that's a social contract that has to be renewed constantly. And museums often, I don't think, appreciate this quite enough. Museums are really good at continuity. They tend to be pretty tradition-bound. And so acts of creative destruction are often not welcome in museums, in spite of what museums say they want to do. And that can be very, very frustrating for people who are working in, sort of middle management or at the departmental level, who are trying to affect change. So in my position, I sort of feel like, and I should say that in our institution, we're an enormous institution. We're the State Archive. We run a network of historic sites, and so I am not the CEO of all of that. There's a lot of digital projects that are going on that have to do with those different aspects of the operation. I run the big museum, so my tradition, where I'm tradition bound, is that I still believe very deeply in the value of destination-based experiences and the sort of social nature of those experiences and the interactive nature of those experiences. And so what I'm most intrigued by and most inclined to reward as a leader in my institution is creative approaches to kind of revivifying the visit, you know, and that doesn't mean that I want to neglect other things. And in fact, because we run a lot of destinations that are not my museum, there's a lot of sort of place-based stuff that's historic. That there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, I think, there in the future. But I feel like how I can be of value to the process is to be skeptical, and skeptical in the right way, which is not to be like a dick and a buzzkill when people are approaching me with stuff, but to really interrogate an idea and say, you know, how is this going to deliver value? How are we going to optimize this in a way that you know, reinforces the social bond or the social value that we have to our audiences? So, you know, one of the things that Ed was sort of provoking us to think about is what are the sorts of things that you're seeing here at this conference that that are intriguing and sort of give you hope about the future, where you see opportunity. And because museums are such a visual experience, I'm really attracted to data visualizations, and I think we're really at the beginning of an immense transformation in how we understand things visually and are able to represent data visually. I think that's one area where I'm very intrigued. Storytelling, of course, is a history institution. You'd think history institutions were more interested in storytelling, but they're really only beginning to know how to do storytelling. And new media is an excellent way of figuring out how to do that. I'm interested in experiential approaches to media, obviously, and I guess I think mobile technology is one of those things that because it has the power to deliver to people things that they need when they need them. There's a certain power there. I think it's still a very primitive. Our use of it so far has been fairly primitive, but it's an incredibly powerful medium with a lot of potential, and I'm interested in anything that has to do with that. And then, of course, social media is a huge area where I think museums have a lot of growing to do. So.
Thank you, and Ed, thank you for inviting the Art Museum contingency here to this. And I'm Brian Ferriso, the director of the Portland Art Museum. And I want to tell a little bit of a story as a sort of an introduction here. I arrived in Portland in 2006, and I called my future administrative assistant, and I said, I need a Palm Pilot, I need a laptop, and I need those two things to talk to each other, and then I need this sort of technology. And she called me back and she said, Brian, that's not even feasible. And I said, well, what do you mean it's not feasible? We don't even have those levels of computers in our institution. And this is 2006 in Portland, Oregon. We had outdated computers. Then I arrived and I asked about how do we pull up the collection? We had no collection digitization whatsoever. I talked about, how do I, again, get my team to talk to each other electronically, mobile devices. Again, none of that happened. And she even said, well, now tell me, when you want a letter written, how do you like it dictated? Do you want me to sit in your office and dictate it from there, or do you want me to call you over the phone? And I said, well, that's really interesting. I actually write my own letter. So this was an institution completely outdated, at least for my experiences. And this was in, again, 2006. Fast forward, we move forward. And to Ed, to answer your question, just your opening comment, I think not having technology is disruptive. I mean, so I think that is a perfect example of not being able to take advantage. And if you are not embracing technology, you will have very strong disruptive forces. So that's the way I look at it. And moving forward, we were able to move the institution forward fairly rapidly. And I've got some of my colleagues here, and Kate Burns is here who helped do that, and Maggie Burns, who now is on my team, moving this forward. And we took on a philosophy, and there were several points I want to make and then turn the mic over. we believed first and foremost that we wanted off-the-shelf technology. So when you come to a director, it's really helpful to know that there is off-the-shelf technology and you're not reinventing the wheel. It creates efficiencies, cost effectiveness, and those sorts of matters. We also took a lot of time searching out local providers. So what I mean by that is we were able to cut some really good deals with designers and technology companies within our community. And in this day and age, with cash being so strapped, working deals and in-kind donations is really valuable. And if you have in-kind providers or providers who are local, I think you can get a lot done. That's number two that we spent a lot of time. We also then took a year or 6 months, and I know Kate was involved with this, of an inventory, an in-depth inventory of the institution to really set the framework. And I heard that Chuck Patch was here. We hired Chuck Patch to come in and really do a strong evaluation of where we were and where we need to go. We are also thinking a lot today about user-driven technology. Rather than us providing the technology, how does the user come to the table and what technologies do they have? And again, I'm seeing some people nod their heads. This is probably a common theme. Again, I go to art museum directors conferences. I haven't been to a computer technology conference. So if I'm repeating myself or you're hearing these things, that's the reason. There is a very important point that does need to be made. I've had multiple conversations with my colleagues in the art museum field about this issue. And it has to do with our tax-exempt status in the United States. We're 501c3 institutions. And as we go into this new reality and this austerity economy, there is a lot of pressure around our tax-exempt status. So one of the things that I think we need to do as institutions, and I've had this conversation in particular with Malcolm Rogers at the MFA in Boston, is get our collections online. We are perceived as institutions that are elite, that we have 75 to 80% of our collections in storage and no one can see them, and they are just these objects collecting dust. And one of the most democratic things we can do to prove our worth is to get our collections online. And that's very, very important. I see that's a key role, at least for our institution. But again, to protect our 501c3 status as we go into this new economy or live with this new economy, the pressures are intense. And I know my colleagues know exactly what I'm talking about. Because again, cutting back on the rate in which people can deduct their taxes, are museums like zoos and golf courses, are museums like swimming pools and entertainment. We need to prove our difference, and we need to use technology to do that, and digitization is key. And finally, my key point here in all of this, I don't care what the technology is, if you don't have the right people, it doesn't work. And our institution has made leaps and bounds because we have great people. And those people come up with creative solutions, they come up with cost-effective solutions, and I think and they create that horizontal buy-in and consensus within the institution to make it work. And so my perspective in conclusion is that we need to make sure we have great people and they're given the opportunities and the freedoms to do their jobs. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all. There we go. And you are all dead on time, which I would like you all to give them a round of applause for that as well.
It's a core competence of senior management.
Well, it's good to see this kind of behavior modeled, though. So, at this point, I'd really just like to open it up to the floor. I mean, I've heard a bunch of things that seem like common threads, but I've been thinking about this for a while, and I'd much rather get your voices in on it. So, do people have any questions or things that came up for them that they'd like to have addressed a little bit more?
We could just argue with each other, too.
Well, I did think about giving you 5 minutes to just respond to each other.
No, please go. No.
All right. We've got one in the back. Let me get the mic to you.
This question is is it Daniel with the Minnesota Historical?
Yeah.
You mentioned that I'm in a small history museum, and there aren't a lot of us here. You mentioned that in history museums, we're only starting to get good at storytelling. What do you think is the future of storytelling in history museums or in museums in general?
Well, I think, there's one thing that people just don't understand as a starting point is that there's a difference between a thesis and a story. And so I think one of the things that we've discovered, and we've done a lot of visitor research on this, is that a really a powerful gateway for people to get into the idea of the past and to understand the past is through the experiences of other individual human people. So, the classic historiography will sort of generalize to a crazy degree, and you wind up losing the individuation in that. So how does that actually express itself in a museum experience? And I think it's through the human voice. It's putting a face to a story. It's and technology is a really powerful means for doing that. We also have immersive spaces. We have a lot of historic buildings and structures and black boxes too, which can be created or recreated in really interesting ways. And so I think theatrical techniques, show control, these things that people tend to think of as theme park kinds of things. I'm not one of those people that dismisses theme parks out of hand. I think the big difference between us and theme parks is that our content isn't junk, but the medium can be quite powerful, and so thinking in those sorts of terms, I think, is key.
Well, just to, sort of schematically, one way we think about this in the science world is that people live their life anecdotally, right? One story at a time. And the world happens statistically, right? The world happens with these big masses of stories agglomerated together, and the understanding of the world has to happen at that statistical scale. Otherwise, you don't have, but the brain is not adapted to understanding the world statistically. So the link between your anecdotal life and the statistical is narrative. How do you make a story that connects an individual's experience to the generalizable experience of whatever population you're dealing with? And that works, the image that we have most about that is around climate change. People live their lives anecdotally. I buy an SUV and it's not any warmer than it was the week before. But we know that there's a change happening statistically. So what we're trying to do is build bridges through technology from the anecdotal to the statistical.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Anyone else? Suze.
I wanted to pick up a couple of things that Eric was talking about. You sort of started by sort of saying you want an open door policy so people could come with ideas, but then later on you got into this idea that senior management have very much of a shared vocabulary and they understand the issues, and that sort of strategic, the ability to do strategic thinking is quite different from good ideas. And I guess I'm wondering what the translation is between, hey, this is an idea, to this can fit in strategically,
right.
But also how people who aren't yet senior management can learn the vocabulary and learn the complexity of the issues, right, so that they can then insert their good ideas more strategically.
Right. So I had an example that just happened. We have this huge disaster in New York. The New York Hall of Science is now a staging ground for Con Edison to repair the rest of the city. And so we have pavilions out back, we have generators out back, it's trucks, and that's sort of where we are right now, outside. And one of our education staff emailed me and said, we should tell the story about what's happening, what Con Ed is doing. And I wrote back to him saying, great idea. And go ahead. And so he sort of wrote back to me and said, well, do we know anybody? And so the point is that we can coach people through the steps of, and I think there's no way of accelerating that other than coaching people. I actually do think that some people have more of an affinity than others. People who are sort of drawn to the academic milieu are drawn to it because they like to do their work and they sort of like to be left alone. And my experience is that people who are drawn to that milieu don't actually translate very well, whatever level of management they're in. So what I really try to do is to coach people to think about audience first. So who would be interested in this? And then think about what would be the medium, how would we do it? And then it's very simple. I say, well, okay, that was a good idea, write it up. And just write it up and I'll coach you through the narrative, right? So send me something. And I would say, if I get 3 things written up in a year, that's a lot. So people are just stymied by that step. Now, so what I was trying to hint before is that we're not as good at that. Management isn't as good about being open as we should be, and we're probably not modeling the kind of behavior that I'm suggesting that the other staff should do. So I didn't mean to suggest that we know how to do it and they don't, and therefore we get to do it. It's more that we have a responsibility to encourage people to participate.
Add a bit to that. If I could add to that, it's something that I spend quite a lot of time thinking about because I've actually worked in museums my whole career. I started off in a role that was so junior it doesn't exist anymore at the Science Museum in London. At that point, curators were graded from A to G, and I was a G. And they haven't had that for years. So I started at the bottom of the heap, and now I'm a museum director. And along the way, I've become what you describe, a senior manager. But it's not something that I went to senior management school. There wasn't an aspect where that worked in. I've simply been in a situation where I've had to pick up things as I go along. And so what I spend a lot of time thinking about is how can I help other people pick up things as they go along? And some of it is stuff that we'd all rather not pick up as we go along. So I spend time talking with people who say, but we really don't understand the finances. And I say, well, when was the last time you got the finance department to come down to your departmental meeting and have them explain to you how the finances work? Well, never, because we thought that'd be boring. Well, I can understand that. But if you want to actually understand how the finances of the organization work, see yourself as a learner. Make those horizontal links, talk with people about those different things, and then you're in a situation where you can have those conversations on the basis that you know how the museum works in that way, and it's a key dynamic. Another aspect is, I mentioned before sort of communication skills and facilitation skills, and those things can be learned quite easily. But again, it's about putting yourself in the situation where you see yourself as having the job of putting in place a process where you can bring people together and you can do things. And sometimes those conversations are called strategic thinking. And when Eric says that it's difficult, the more people that you have in the room to do that, he's absolutely right. But if you can find a way of doing it with 40 people in the room, even if it's just for an afternoon, then that can also be quite helpful. And anybody can do that. That's something that lots of people can do. And so I think that there are a whole range of ways like this that people can pick up these things as they go along, because I think if you don't do it, then in a funny way you're making the choice not to do it. You're making the choice not to decide that you need to look at things from a different perspective, or not to decide that some dynamics are important or other unimportant to you. And so I would just encourage people to get out there and have those conversations that they really didn't think they wanted to have.
Can I add a little bit, because I think it's a really good question. The term I use is managing up. And again, Janet, similar to you, and I think all of us, I started as an intern, and the way you move forward is you manage up. And we all have boards of trustees and bosses, as Eric indicated, so I continually have to manage up, figure out what they are looking for, matching the strategic goals of the institution with their needs, and moving the institution forward. So again, it's thinking in those terms, and I would agree with what Eric and Janet said, but just adding even a little bit more of trying to, again, put yourself in the boss's shoes or trying to manage them up.
Another thing that we sort of talked about a little over breakfast this morning was this idea of, really coalition building, that there are certain things that you can make irresistible if you've got allies, And so, looking outside of the silo of your particular domain and making sure that you're working laterally across the institution. Of all the things that I've noticed the most in my career over about 30 years is this idea that, is this sense that hierarchies are really starting to flatten. And I don't think that's just in museums. I think that's throughout the working world. And as they flatten, it puts more demand on the kind of relationships that you build across an institution. And you tend to think of these hierarchies like the CEO is the skinniest point in the hourglass, and everything's kind of getting stuck in that skinny pipe, and then he's trying to manage up to a huge board of trustees or whatever upstream stakeholders he's got. But there's nothing like a kind of a coherent group of determined individuals with a common vision to persuade minds.
There's, as somebody trying to think of sort of what would be a 30-second, 2-minute case study, and how to. Laura was just mentioning Scavenger. I didn't know about it, and this was where I'm at. And we've been talking about doing scavenger hunts in our museum for a long time. And I didn't know about this tool, and it makes it easier to do it, and it makes it interesting and more flexible, and we should try it. So I can go into the CEO and say, I don't even have to go to the CEO. I can go to my staff and say, but let's say I'm not at senior management and I think I want to do this. So what I need to do is I need to alert me. Basically, it's kind of like what we would do if we were fundraising, right? A foundation, I call up a foundation and I say, this is really important. Here's the audience that we're interested in serving. Here's the technology. And they say, that suits our interests sufficiently that we'd like you to draw up a prospectus about this. And that's kind of the next step. What does a prospectus look like? What does a 2-page document look like that's going to communicate the core of the idea? And actually, if there's one thing one sort of skill that I would urge you to understand is, what does it take to summarize in a way that has significant impact and is likely to get your audience's eye what the core of your idea is, and what are the categories that need to go into that. Here's the overview, right? This is what I'm thinking about doing, and it's 3 sentences. And here's the audience that I'm thinking about serving, and that's another 3 sentences. And this is why it's something. And here's how I think we can get it funded, and here's a sense of what it's going to cost. It really is 2 pages, and it has a couple of nice pictures in it that show, that to get the point across. And you can do that easy. It really is easy, and it's a really good exercise. And because it helps you clarify your own thoughts, and then you can have your colleagues contribute to that, so that you really feel you have a good, concise, punchy summary document. And that's what I would do if I was approaching a funder that I hadn't gotten money from before. And as a matter of fact, it would translate nicely if the CEO then said, "Well, this is a great idea. I do have a funder in mind, and I can use this." So it's just a punchy, easy thing to do, and it's a really great skill to develop no matter where you're headed. And so I would encourage you to take any idea you have right now that you really want to do and do that. And it's a good exercise. And matter of fact, if you wanted to do that and you wanted to email them to me, I would look at them and give you feedback on that. So my email is esiegel, ESIEGEL, @nysci.org. And I'll be curious how many I get, right? Because I've been through this with my staff. I said, do that, and I don't get many. So this is a challenge. If you have an idea and you want some feedback, send it to me. If it doesn't get caught in my spam filter, I will get back to you.
Rock
I
on,
left
Eric.
myself an out.
Hi there. I'd like to just pick up on the point Brian made about the way to kind of fend off critics is to make your digital collections available online. What I'd like to say is that I think it needs to go further than that, and in a way the best way to silence your critics is to show that you're not only providing access to it, but you're allowing people to take and reuse the information you have. And I'm thinking in particular things like the Library of Congress putting their tens of thousands of images on Wikimedia Commons, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam with their Rijksstudio project, where it explicitly encourages people to take stuff. And there's a huge difference between saying, here's our collection, look, don't touch, and here's everything we've got, feel free to use it for whatever purpose you see fit. So I guess my question for the panel is, in your institutions, are you doing this? And if not, why not? What are the barriers to this that need to be overcome?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. It's about facilitating the usage, and I think we're at a point where we're just really starting to think on those terms. And again, I've got one of my staff members here, and Maggie, I don't know if you want to add to that, but you're pretty active in making sure once we get it digitized, we get it out there and used, whether it's Twitter feeds or on the website or object of the day, pushing it out. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Maggie.
No, I just want to say that I completely 100% agree, and we are in the early stages of sort of digital art access across the board at the museum, and so I think we're at an exciting point where we can take advantage of what we've learned from everybody else, but we're also doing it for the first time where we are. So we're trying to embrace new and innovative ideas and create an atmosphere of open access, but we're also a little bit constrained by the limitations of just starting and being small and having really limited resources, which I think we're doing a great job of using. And I think the question, the idea of learning how to communicate the core of your idea to senior management is something that as a young professional, I'm trying to work on every single day just to get better at that. I think because I think it's an institutional question. So I can say I completely agree with that, and that's what we should do. But I think we need to talk as an institution about what our tech strategy is going to be and where do we stand across the board. Where do all of the departments stand? How are we going to work together to achieve that? So I think that for someone like us, like that needs to be our first step. But I'd love for us to get there.
You know, I think there's a subset of this question, or a kind of a microcosm of this question, is your institution's photography policy, you know? And, you know, are you letting people take pictures in your museum? People want to take pictures in their museum. They want to, you know, they want to take photographs, film in their museum visits. And, you know, we're still clenching. You know, there's something that we don't want to let go of. There's some sense of ownership or something around this. And I understand that some art museums really do have restrictive agreements with the originators of artworks or and so forth. But you know, we've pursued this policy of a totally liberal photography policy in our institution because we no longer want to erect this barrier between our stuff and what people want to do with their stuff around keepsaking, you know, their experience with us. So.
I think this is a great example of a question which you can think about from a strategic point of view if you're a strategic manager. So let's just do that for a couple of seconds. If we think about the challenges in terms of taxation that were mentioned by Brian early on, that's one aspect that's coming from one big stakeholder, that's coming from government, and that's bound up with all sorts of ethos of service to the community, of impact that you might have, of how you fit into a democratic process, of how you can maintain your not-for-profit status. Then we've got another bunch of stakeholders who are the users. And the interesting thing about the users is that they are both a group of stakeholders, but they're also a source of income for the museum as well from particular times. And so many museums see their users as a source of earned income, not necessarily in terms of the admission through the door, but it might be in terms of paying for something to do with some aspect of the museum. And over the last 20 years, and I happen to think it's been a fairly fruitless discussion. There's been a lot of time spent on, quote unquote, how museums can monetize their intellectual property. Mm-hmm. And we've been asked how you do that at a time when resources are very tight. So that's another bunch of stakeholders. And then there's another aspect, which are the donors and the philanthropists and the people who've supported the organization, whether it's financially or in kind, who might, when they made their gift, have given their gift at a particular point in time where there were some things that were important, like, for instance, whether or not it could be reproduced or whether it was on display or how it was worked. And one of the things that we also have to do is that we have to steward all those relationships. You know, so I talk to people who might be the grandchildren of the people who made a gift to the museum, but they're a stakeholder for me and I have to be able to take their interest into account as well. So when I come at a problem like that, I'm thinking about it in kind of a soup of all of those different things. And there's no black and white. It's a series of different grey issues. And then what happens is that things change over time. You know, if a technology comes along that disrupts this to the extent that now one of those things starts to outweigh the other thing, you know, it becomes clear we're not going to make any money out of intellectual property. But on the other hand, access to a resource might suddenly become really important for our tax status. Then this will change the dynamics in those sorts of things. But so I just mentioned that as a case study for the kinds of conversations that I have to have about these sorts of things, that I can rarely compartmentalize them. I have to think about them in lots of different ways. So there you go.
We don't have a collection, so it's not a problem for us. But all right, it's liberated. But what I always wonder when I hear about this is who wants it. You know, I don't mean that negatively. I mean, who wants it? Is there a pull or is there a push? Right? Yeah. We think people should want this. Right, a lot of stuff that we do in science museums and museums, we think people should want this. We think people should want a tool where they can organize an exhibition themselves on the wall digitally. Mm-hmm. And you know, they put the tool out there, they spend a lot of money on the tool, and then you know, a few people use it, and that's it. So there's no evidence in my mind that, you'd have to develop the evidence and be really sure of it, that there's a demand for this. Pushing things out into the world because you think they should be wanted is complicated. It doesn't mean you should never do that, because you might be ahead of the curve and you're thinking more in ways that people hadn't anticipated yet. You anticipate a need, one of these. But in general, I need to be convinced pretty quickly as a senior manager that there is a pull, not just us pushing.
Right.
Absolutely. All right, next. I'd like everybody to notice how little we've actually talked about technology.
Boop.
This
beep.
is sort of a broad question for all of you, maybe. You're all talking about digitizing collections, or Eric, you said that nothing's only going to exist in the museum, which is really interesting. And I was just curious what your thoughts are on the role of the physical space when so much is online. And earlier, I think it was actually Curtis Wong or somebody in that session mentioned it being emotive or emotional. The space is the emotional part, and what happens online is the intellectual part. So I was just curious to hear what your thoughts on that were, if you agree with that, or.
You go.
You want me to take? I'm the emotion guy. I think one of the sad things about the Western tradition is that we have created a artificial dualism between cognition and emotion, and so I think that one of the wonderful things that museums do is that they create opportunities for curiosity. They're generative of curiosity. In fact, I think museums are better at generating curiosity than they are in answering questions. And so, yeah, I'm still like a meat space guy. I believe in the real world. I think that people are always going to want to go out, that eventually your eyes glaze over when you're looking at your screen all day long. And yet, this new technology does represent a challenge to those meat spaces. And I was just giving out candy on Halloween, and looking out my window and seeing a whole line of adults on the sidewalk with their noses in their phones, while the kids are strangely dressed up as people from the 80s. I don't understand what that's all about, but they were like Michael Jackson's and Jane Fonda workout video, and I'm like, dude, how do they even know about this stuff? But
it's online.
It's because it's online, right. So yeah, I think the challenge for us is how to continue to think about how we're revivifying these sort of destination experiences that we're creating, and I think there is a dynamic tension with the nose in the screen and the being in the now that a satisfying museum visit requires, and I think that's not irreconcilable necessarily, but it's a problem that needs to be figured out, and I think it's a really interesting challenge, and it's going to be, a lot of you guys are going to be, I'm not going to be the one to figure it out, it's going to be up to you guys to figure that out.
I would agree with that, and I would say that there's a huge opportunity for us because we deal in the real thing, and as people go through and figure out for themselves how much they want to go out and how much they want to stay home and how much they want to be connected and how much they don't want to be connected, that there's a level of adaptability that we need to show in that. Most people who come to the Royal Ontario Museum are now connected all the time. They have a phone with them if they want to be chatting with their friends or posting on Facebook that they're playing with their kids in the gallery, or even Googling stuff, which they do quite a lot if they don't like what they read on our labels. They Google their own answers, and all of that is fine. So we're already in that world, and that's good. And so working with people as to when they want to focus just on that real thing and when they want to do something different to that is something where I think there's a lot now that we need to do to experiment, to try things out, to pilot with people, and I think that the museums have a huge advantage over some other semi-academic institutions, dare I say. I spend a lot of time talking to people in universities, and they're incredibly envious of us. And the reason they're envious of us is that we have a built-in public face. Every morning we open the doors, people come in, And we have the opportunity to talk with them directly about what they might want to do in our space. And one of my great feelings of potential and optimism for museums is that we have that opportunity. One of my feelings of frustration is that we don't do it nearly often enough. But there's a huge opportunity for us because we have that built-in public face if we get to use it correctly. So I think we need to figure out what it is that people want for us, but I think they will want both a physical space, and they'll want to be connected, and they'll want to access us from anywhere, and we need to figure out how to do all those things.
Libraries and parks are two really interesting models. People go out. They just they go out. They go out to coffee shops. They go out to libraries. They go out to parks. People want to be with each other, and I'm stunned. In Queens, when you build a library, it's like digging a hole in the ground where there's a high water table. It just fills right up, and and as soon as you build another one, it's filled, and there's just in our community, which is a low-income immigrant community, there is just a desperate need for safe, rich environments that have the potential to make your kid's life better. And that's kind of the niche that we fill in our community, and we don't do it as well as I think we will in the future. But it's a critical need for for the immigrant communities. The kids are babysitting their younger brothers. They just need a place and ideally it's a place that's not just about playing video games and watching TV. It's a place where they're getting help with their homework and enriching experiences. So that's a direction that we're thinking about. So it's a little bit of the social service model that the libraries have set up for themselves, and there's a tension there, but it feels valuable to us. So.
Hi, this is not a technological question, but I'd just like to get some insight from the panel. What is the ratio of people coming to you with problems to those coming to you with great ideas, and which is worse?
How do you tell the difference? Do you have a?
Sure. I've never had that question posed, but I think in my early tenure, so I'd say first 3-4 years, it was all problems, and now it's all about opportunities. Once you build your team, once you know your constituency, once you know your board, once you know what the issues are for the institution, I think there's a certain point that it all becomes opportunities.
I think one of the profound misunderstandings we have about ideas is that the idea is the thing, and I think ideas are plentiful and cheap, and the hard part is picking a good idea and then letting it develop in a way where you don't kill the essence of the thing. Somebody smarter than me once said, a good way to get a good idea is to get a lot of ideas, and I really do believe that a good way to approach things is to cover the waterfront. So we do try to solicit ideas on a regular basis, and in a history museum, a lot of the same old ideas tend to crop up again and again, because history apparently is self-similar, in weird ways. But I guess I can't emphasize enough how important the process is in rendering an idea in form. So I'm always sort of skeptical. People always ask me, like, where did you get that idea? And I always say, I can't remember, because usually they have morphed a great number of times before they ever actually get realized.
There's a great phrase from Stephen Johnson, I think, called the adjacent possible. Where great ideas come from. There's a book where great ideas called the adjacent possible. And somebody who comes, the idea that there's going to be some discontinuous idea that nobody ever thought of, I get those never. Typically it's one, I could count them on one hand. Typically, we're working on a problem. There's some issue that we're trying to deal with, and somebody has a good approach to dealing with it, right? So it's an idea, but it's about a problem, right? So without being facetious, it's kind of both, right? They're coming with a problem, and we come up with an idea. Oh my God, I never thought of that. it's just vanishingly rare, and typically not really great, because you're looking around the perimeter of things that you're working on. I might be different from these people in that I actually have like line project management responsibilities. I have 4 or 5 projects that I'm actually moving ahead at any given time. So I haven't been separated from that part. And so, everything I do, 90% of the meetings I have are about how to move those projects ahead and, how they fit into the larger context. So, again, there's a set of problems we're all dealing with, and then there's sort of potential solutions to them.
I would say for me it's about 3/4 problems and about 1/4 good ideas. And whenever I go and talk to people, there are lots more ideas out there. And I say, why don't I ever get to hear about this? And they say, oh, well, we just thought it never's going to happen. So they hadn't raised them as a good idea. And so, I would agree with what's been said so far. I just throw in a little extra on that one. So I became sufficiently concerned about this that when I was at AAM last year, and I heard a woman called Kathy McLean, who many of you will know. She'd been working on a project with Pew, which was called No Idea Too Ridiculous, and she'd done that work in Philadelphia. And so I brought her to the museum, and we did a workshop. And she did a couple of workshops actually with my staff over 2 days, and talked with them about how, if you've got an idea, what you might do with it, where it might go, how you might start small, how it doesn't have to cost a lot of money, and we're going to continue experimenting with that. I'm hoping to bring her back, and her next workshop will be how to get managers to say yes to those ideas when people have raised them.
Mm-hmm. I'd just like to follow up with Janet. I find it interesting that you're talking about bringing in somebody, Kathy McLean, to work with your staff, help them generate positive ideas versus seeing everything as a problem. And yet when you talked about your stakeholders, you didn't mention your staff. And so is there a distinction to you between the groups?
Let me think about that. Why didn't I think of my stakeholders as my staff? Because they're my team, because we're all in it together. And so you're right. I could identify the staff as a particular stakeholder group, but in that particular conversation, I assumed they were standing next to me rather than a group that I was having to interact with in that way. But of course, staff are major stakeholders, and I'm constantly looking for ways that we can solve problems together and that we can do these things. And part of it is where I am. I'm really struck by what Brian said about how things have changed in the time span. I've been at the Royal Ontario Museum for 2 years, and we're at the point where we've worked together and through some participatory strategic planning, put together a new plan. We've come through the first year of that. We've got some financial issues that we've been sorting out this year, and a lot of that's been very tough for everybody. And we've got some fantastic things that we're working on. And effectively, I think we're now in the process of re-engineering and reinventing the whole museum. And the level of cultural change that I'm asking people to go through is so significant that that's why a lot of the things that I'm mentioning are about how to give people the skills and how to give people the sense of control over their destiny, that they can be active participants in these things rather than feeling that it's just kind of rolling straight over them. And so that's, I think, in that sense, I spend a lot of time thinking about my staff and how we might work together in those terms. And of course, they're stakeholders. But when I'm thinking about, say, government, I'm assuming that the staff are standing next to me on that one. Yeah.
One thing that occurred to me was this. One of the things that I do is I assemble teams. And you tend to think of them as these sort of human dynamic chemistry sets. But you also, I think, want to kind of, if a project has not been presented to you by all of the people who wind up being on that team, you really want to be thinking about, as a matchmaker, what is going to be the perfect project for that person at that point in their career, has the trajectory of their career up to that point prepared them for that project? Is it one that they will enjoy, sinking their teeth into? And you do, I at least try to and it's not always simple because you're juggling schedules and the staggered project timeline and things like that. But there are some good ideas that your institution probably just cannot do because you don't have the depth chart, to make that happen, and you just have to be kind of realistic about that. There are also, I think, ideas that have a zeitgeist. There'll be, I like to think that, there are certain ideas that we just keep in a bag and they're in Brownian motion, kind of just being there. But there's a moment in time when all of a sudden a funding opportunity presents itself, or there's a natural disaster in the city of New York or whatever it is, and suddenly that idea becomes mature, and the people who have been dying to kind of champion that thing get the handoff to make it real, and that's a really interesting moment. So.
Anyone?
This is a question, I guess, for any of you. I'm from the Wisconsin Historical Society. Hi, neighbor.
Hi.
We are in the process right now of planning and considering planning and possibly constructing a new Wisconsin Historical Museum in downtown Madison. And we're doing this in partnership with the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. And my question for all of you would be, we have an opportunity to not only rigorously examine new ways of doing things, new initiatives, but also go back and use the same rigorous examination for things that we're already doing, the way we're already doing things, because we will have a brand new facility and beyond the four walls of that facility as well. Have any of you taken that same approach? You've talked about the rigorous examination of new initiatives. Have you taken that same approach for the ways you've traditionally done things over the last 20 years? And if so, what have you learned?
You go.
Okay, I'll start. As part of our strategic planning process, I arrived at the museum after a major capital project where there'd been the building of an extension of the museum and the redisplay of many of the galleries and permanent collections. And I was coming in after all of that. And so I asked the staff to take me back through that process. And I asked that we go back further than that because we happen to have a centennial coming up in 2 years' time, so we're 98 years old right now, so we were 96 when we started this project, and it was an opportunity to understand where the museum had come from and what we'd done and how we traditionally worked. And it was a real eye-opener for me because what I discovered was, for a research-based organization, and we're an encyclopedic museum, I should have probably introduced that at the beginning, we have everything from dinosaurs through to contemporary art. And we have what I thought was actually, because of that construction project, I expected to find a lot of integration, a lot of teamwork approach to things, a lot of groups that knew each other very well. And much to my surprise, what I found was that at the end of that project, those things had all dispersed, or many of the people had left at that point, and what the museum had kind of like reverted back to is what it had been before for many years, which was effectively a research stream, which was the research and the collections, which was very academically focused, very much behind the scenes, very much focused on the individual disciplines of archaeology, anthropology, art history, and so on and so forth. And then a programs and education strand, which is what you saw if you walked in through the front door. And so it was a real surprise to me because I assumed that the project that had been a 10-year project had transformed the organization. And in fact, what it done is it temporarily transformed the organization into project mode, and then it had switched back again. And so if I was embarking on things for a new facility, I would be taking a really good look at how the organization has been set up and the way that things have been organized, because what we're doing now is we're transforming all of that internally, because we recognize that our audience's needs have changed, and so how we should be organized should be quite different. But I think the mistake I'd made when I first arrived is that I'd assumed that any big project would be transformational, and now I think that it's only going to be transformational if it's intentionally transformational. And so that would be my suggestion.
I have a little bit of a response, and I actually was the deputy director at the Milwaukee Art Museum, so I have some sense of this, given the transformation that institution went through in 2001, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. I'm a big believer in trying to understand what else others have done and have dealt with this issue of transformation and the challenges they've faced, whether it's a new building, whether it's going to a new space, going to new ideas, new concepts. And I do think there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of our colleagues do have that information and great experience, so you can always pick up the phone and ask them, how did you approach this? That being said, I also think solutions are localized. So what I mean by that is, within the context in which any institution is operating, the solution is not outside of that area. The solutions are right in front of you, but you need to understand and take the time to understand the context in which you're operating to find those solutions and to find the best strategy and pathway to move the project forward or the institution forward, or understand, again, your stakeholders, the key players, to make that initiative a success.
I think legacy systems, in our experience, legacy systems of any kind are only changed when they become dysfunctional, right? So so let's look at one of the things that I think is most interesting to us right now is, what is the legacy system for internal staff communication, and what are the implications that we're doing, and what are the potentials for transformation there? So it turns out that senior management is never at the museum. We're just never there. I mean, if I'm there 1 day a week, 2 days a week on average, that is, pretty good. That's not good. That's not useful. That's not functional, right? And I spend a lot of my time working on the road, and as do all of my colleagues. So that's forcing us to take a look, and going back to technology, what are the affordances that technology provide that allow us to re-envision what it means to work at the New York Hall of Science. And it also implies a lot of things about the type of systems that we put around that. So how do I, as a manager, both approve and then sort of evaluate the work that somebody's doing when they're not around? And so we have to institute a whole new evaluation system and a whole new set of criteria and a set of policies. So I think that those things force themselves on us rather than us sort of willingly reopen a box. If your accounting system is working just fine, that's great. But if you're not getting budget reports until 3 months after, 3 or 4 months after the month is closed, then you have an issue, and it's time to look at some changes. So that, in my world, is how things that are legacy end up by changing.
For me to have a question. Oh, Judy. Your question, then mine.
So this is a staff.
They're quick questions, but slow answers, right? So.
Rich answers. This is a staff development question. I was really struck the other day by what Shanna Crossan at Minnesota Historical was talking about, the way that internally they were shifting their perspectives to meet the needs of 21st century learners.
Yep.
And so she talked about the divide between digital natives, the people who are coming of age and understanding and have this language, and those of us who are digital immigrants, and there may even be some people who are not immigrating. What, if anything, do you do to help your staff, it's not just age related, your staff who are digital immigrants or who haven't decided to speak this new language, to learn and be comfortable with a new language, and vice versa? How are you helping your staffs cross that divide so that you don't create new kinds of silos among the, I want to say young and old, but isn't that? It's the natives and the immigrants. Find a common language.
Well, you just made me nervous, because I'm not purposeful in this at all. I don't think about it. And I think my thoughts that were going through my head as you were asking that question is, get on board or get off. I mean, and I think we as an institution, and what I would say to my team is, we're heading forward, and whether it's the staff or the or the board, we're pushing ahead. Now, when it comes to audience, I think it's a more complicated issue, because again, I would actually look to the panel or you all to say, what are the strategies that we should think about bringing our audiences into this realm? Because I certainly don't have that answer.
I'm a big believer, because of my children's museum background, in learning by doing. So when you create these cross-disciplinary teams, ideally you've got some cross-section of representation on that team that is reflective of the diversity of knowledge around those things. And that being said, I mean, I think it's actually really hard, because even the people who are pretty knowledgeable around this don't really know what it means. I mean, we are now growing up with kids who, I was reading in the New York Times the other day that people are throwing their phones into the crib, and kids are learning how to navigate through the phones before they can even speak, and are developing facility at finding the games they want to play. And I don't think anybody here has any idea what this means. You know, those kids aren't grown up yet. But I think we do, and maybe anxiety is just the right word for it, know that this is going to be, this is going to change everything, and that we, you know, maybe the most universal way of thinking about it is to model comfort with change, to not be panicky, to not be defensive or resistant impulsively, to listen to what people are talking about, try to understand what the hell is going on, you know, and that's a real challenge. I mean, you know, my first exposure to a computer was in high school, and it was the size of 3 refrigerators and had 1 keyboard for a school of 2,500 kids, and we saved our programs on paper tape, you know. And so now, you know, kids are carrying supercomputers around in their pockets. And so, you know, we're behind. You know, I have the feeling that we're really behind the curve. We're just beginning to figure out what this means. But, you know, but I do think trying to kind of model a sense of comfort for it, of saying it's going to be all right, that some iteration is absolutely necessary. We are going to run down some blind alleys. We need to tear up some work along the way. We're just going to learn by doing, I guess.
We're a science and technology museum, so you don't really even apply for the job if you know you don't have an appetite for technology. Mm-hmm. We position the museum across the board as a laboratory for trying new things. And if you don't have a comfort and a curiosity and appetite for trying new things, you know, it's pretty clear that we just don't hire you. You know, and as far as people who are there who don't, I can't think of anybody. So yeah, that's a little bit of a special case.
Wow, I'm really jealous at that answer.
No curators.
The whole idea of the 21st century skills, I think, it presents a huge challenge, because I know, how can we be interacting with our audience and understand their needs if we haven't explored these things ourselves? And before I worked at the Royal Ontario Museum, I used to work at the Australian Museum in Sydney, and we were in a situation there where social media was exploding all around our ears, and we had no money for training and we weren't quite sure what we would do, but there were a couple of people in the organization who had been the early adopters. One of them, many of you will know, who's Linda Kelly, who was part of my team. And so here's a great idea, which came from, I think, perhaps a very Australian way of life, which is that we decided that we would have talks which were peer-to-peer learning. I mean, that's the technical term for it, but in practice it was if you came at 4 o'clock with a mug, you would get a cup of tea and a Tim Tam, and Linda or whoever else it was who was there that week would take people through how to set up a Twitter account, how to put together a Facebook page. And these were in the days when this was very, very new for a lot of people. And what was wonderful about it was that it was a group of people learning together, and it was exactly the kind of low-tech, in that way, example of problem solving, of a group of people who were deciding to learn together and do some problem solving. And actually it was fantastic, and people would go away and they'd have a go at a few things, and they'd open up accounts and they'd tweet to each other. And one of the things that I then realized that I was going to have to do is I was going to have to model this behavior as well. So I opened a Twitter account and got involved in doing that. And I was just saying before this session started that I'm about to have to take the next step in modeling that behavior, because we're about to launch a web platform at the museum which democratizes access to publishing throughout any member of staff who wants it. And as part of that, of course, if people want to have a blog, they can have a blog. And so now I've done a couple of guest blogs for other people, but I've always fought shy of taking that particular step. But now I'm going to have to start a blog, because if I don't, how do I say to my staff, who I want to be blogging and I want to be doing other things, that, you know, that they should have a go at it if I haven't tried it myself? And so I have to say I have a lot of fun with working out how to try and model these behaviors. And I'm not even an early adopter. I'm an early majority, I think it's called. I wait for everybody else to get the iPhone and work out the bugs in it, and then I buy one 2 years later. So, you know, I'm quite proud of that aspect, but I have to push myself forward and try and model some of these things, and I'm sure some of these guys have tried that as well. But it's I think we're just all learning, and so if we see ourselves as learners in it, we can take it from there. And the Tim Tams help those people who haven't been to Australia.
More Tim Tams.
Hi, I'm Rose Sherman. I'm the head of Dan's colleague. I'm the director of the customer-facing technologies and the staff use of technology. So I can echo what Dan and Janet are saying about modeling behavior, but from the technologist perspective, it's really, I tell my staff, and I do myself, it's really important to take people where they are. And if where they are is really uncomfortable, that means I get up out of my desk and I go to the CFO's office and I show her how to use Gmail or her calendar. We went through a Google Apps conversion this year, and the reason we did it, it's cheap. Sure, it's cheaper. It's a disaster recovery thing, but my number one thing was because our schools are predominantly going Google Apps, and our staff needed to understand how to use the same tools that our customers were using. And it also enables us to be more collaborative across the state, across projects and across our historic sites around the state. And I wanted to say to you, Brian, too, and thinking about our digital natives, I'm involved in a lot of projects of technology and education, and really focusing on the K-12 market outside the galleries. Dan's got it covered in the galleries. And we take people where they are. We create things called personas, and maybe you're familiar with them, but really they're fictional people that you give a face to, literally a picture, and you give them characteristics. And you think about how they might be using your product. And in our case, it might be the development of a website, but it also could be your gallery. It's whatever your product could be, or your public program. And in our education personas, some of what we have are, one woman's called Rhonda Reynolds, and that's an alliteration for a technology rabbit. And a rabbit is somebody who's highly comfortable with technology and wants to go off at a fast pace. And we have Sally Schneider, who's the educator technology person, who's a snail. And she's very uncomfortable with technology. And those aren't terms that I came up with. Those are terms that I found out from working with one of our media specialists in one of our school districts. So we have those personas, and we really think about how they're going to be using and what their comfort levels with technology are. And we try to really take people where they're at.
All right, now can I ask a question? So one of the first things that I will obviously wind up doing when I get home is, well, Ed, what did you learn at MCN? And the one thing that I think I would take away from this session in particular is the challenge that you've all sort of laid down in different ways, Eric very explicitly, of there is much less asking for permission necessary, I think, than oftentimes we tend to think there is. In many ways, we limit our own sense of agency in terms of finding out what is the way forward. So the notion of, you've all talked a lot about consensus building and looking horizontally across the organization and managing up and managing down, all of which place the burden of getting things done and moving us forward on all of you. There's not someone else out there who has the
Sorry.
So that's probably the thing that I'm going to take back. So my question to all of you with the exception maybe of Brian, since you literally just got here, is when you get back to your museums, next week, and your staff says, "So, what'd you learn at MCN?" What are you going to tell them?
Asking us? Oh, okay. Well, I guess I would say that first of all, I'm impressed by the sense of community, and that's probably the thing that So there's this group of people who are meeting out there and talking about stuff. I'm actually impressed by the degree to which, when I last participated in this type of community, it was mostly about collections, and I'm impressed by the degree to which people have moved. The conversation has broadened. Now it includes collections, but includes all kinds of interpretive approaches, and so I think the breadth of technology solutions that people are looking at are, and I'm also impressed. I'm thinking out loud here by the degree to which the questions that are being asked here overlap with the questions that are being asked in other museum gatherings that I'm part of. That they aren't particularly technology specific. When I was teaching, I teach at NYU, and the first year I taught was about 7 years ago, and everybody was like, "We're going to use technology to do this, and the museum's going to disappear, and it's going to be all virtual, and blah, blah, blah." And by about 2 years ago, people were back to, we need to figure out how to reach our audience. We need to, and by any means possible. So, it stopped being sort of about technology, and I think I've seen that a little bit reflected in this discussion. It's not so much about technology; it's about doing good work. Right, and in whatever context, and computers are sort of a given. Yeah, okay, fine, we got them. Now, what are we going to do with them? I think there was a little bit less gee-whizom. There's not that. I think the improvements in technology are a little bit more at the margins now, and a little bit less right down the center line. There are certain givens about social access and contributions. That's a huge change, by the way. The idea that there should be that we should be incorporating visitor voices into how we create our experiences. Again, that's parallels what you hear in the rest of the museum world, but technology is at the heart of a lot of that. Mm-hmm. So, I think probably the one thing is the degree to which there's been emerging of what you guys are talking about and what the museum community in general has been talking about, and that reflects the fact that technology is not a bauble anymore. It's sort of critical to what we're doing.
I'm just scrolling through the 3 pages of notes that I've taken while I've been here and not finding anything that I can summarize for Ed in that way. So there's a huge amount that I'm taking away with me. I think for me it's really interesting to meet a new community, and I also am struck about the way that I think you come across as a pretty coherent community, and that's a good thing. Well done. I'm personally struck as somebody who is wanting to make some changes in how we use technology and how in our organisation about what we can learn from speaking with your community. And so it's great that you are so connected and networked and open to those conversations. I'm also amazed how many of you have job titles that didn't even exist a couple of years ago. I think that this is an area of museums which is very fast moving, which we're still making it up as we go along, where a lot of you are trailblazers in what you're doing in individual institutions, and I think there's a lot that can be shared from that. And the other thing is, I took away, and this is. It's always good to hear this when you're in my role, because you hear it less frequently when you sit in the director's office, is the them and us conversations. I feel as though I've heard a lot of them and us conversations over the last few days, and the them could be curators or marketers or evaluators but there are quite a few them and us conversations, and I would just, if I could make one suggestion, it would be to see the diversity of different perspectives that you have in your organizations as a strength rather than a weakness. If you can form those coalitions that we were talking about earlier on across that group of people, then you're going to have really, really good products. And so that would be my only thought, is that I've been really struck by the amount of them and us that I've heard. And it's not a criticism, because you hear it in a lot of places, but I would just make that suggestion.
What they said. I guess, I'm really struck. This is my first time at this conference, and you know, I've always, just as a professional, I've always had to triage the conferences I go to. So yeah, the idea of a community of affinity and of work is something really to be underlined here. I'm sort of dazzled by how smart a group this is, and so I'm a little, I'm even a little intimidated by how smart it is. And one of the things I was thinking about was how unusual or idiosyncratic career tracks tend to be through institutions. And I think it's just a matter of time before a technologist becomes a CEO in one of these institutions. And so maybe some of the frustration that you're feeling is simply that it's a very new domain. Museums are not entirely hospitable to new things and are still in the business of trying to make room for them. But given the facility that people here have, the kind of intelligence that people have, I don't think it'll be long before we start seeing technology people moving into the upper tiers of leadership in institutions. And when that happens, it's going to be a really interesting moment for the field. And I think we're going to start to see some really interesting things blossom. So bravo, all of you guys. I'm really impressed by what I've seen at this conference.
So I'll take a crack at this one. And Ed was right, I arrived about 40 minutes ago. But
you're a brave man. We appreciate it.
I'd say this. I thought it was just me, and when I go to my conferences, that we have to sit in these rooms with no windows. So I think there's a great future for an architect to understand and develop conference centers with windows. And I feel like we're sitting in this room overlooking the beautiful Seattle, and we can't see it. So that's what I realize we're all the same.
All right, I think we have time for one more if anyone has any. All right. If not, then I would like to just reiterate Eric's challenge in case you've forgotten. If you have good ideas that you would like to get some feedback on, a museum director has offered to...
I'm serious. I'm not worried about being overwhelmed.
The gauntlet has been thrown down. So if nothing happens, it's all our fault.
I'll extend the invitation as well. I'll double down on that.
There you go. So CC him.
All right. Well, I would like to thank all four of you for being willing to come out and undertake a slightly unusual assignment of facing a group of your colleagues. So
we're the them that they've been talking about. Right?
Well, you know,
we have met the
anymore.
enemy, and they are us.
All right. Well, Janet, Eric, Dan, Brian, thank you very, very much.